In 2 years I went from drawing this, to this, to this, to finally this. And in this video I share my progress and talk about different things I was focusing on during the 2 years, the improvements I made. So to anyone who's just starting out or already has been drawing for some time, I hope you will be able to learn from what I share and get inspired. I'm not gonna talk about each individual piece, since for all of them I would point out around the same things that could be better, which would include the proportions, anatomy, perspective, face symmetry, sometimes the coloring, shading and line work. But later on I'll talk about these different aspects and point out what I improved on or stylistic changes I made over time. However, I would also enjoy doing a video where I critique my old art and maybe redraw it in the future to really focus on the individual art pieces more. Let's start out with some background information about what I was focusing on in my art. I've been drawing traditionally since around 2005, basically since I was 3 years old. I started with drawing mainly horses, then characters, and I draw as a hobby from time to time. There were phases in my life where I would draw more or less. I wasn't doing it as a habit or routine. Because of this I was only improving slowly. I mostly drew from real life with realistic proportions and sometimes characters from cartoons. I also wanted to do a video talking about my full art evolution someday and show these old drawings as well as redraw some of them. Maybe I'll do it in 2025, since then it will be 20 years that I actually drew. I started drawing digitally after deciding I'd want to study animation and game after school. In the beginning I was very focused on getting used to drawing the tablet and experimenting a lot. I mainly drew characters but also some backgrounds, and at that time I was also working on a portfolio for applying the university. Afterwards I got interested in anime. I heard from many other artists through YouTube that they started with drawing anime or started drawing since they were interested in anime and cartoons. Later on they learned more about realistic proportions, whereas for me I started with mostly realistic proportions and then moved on to drawing more stylized anime proportions. I also got into the art community. Before, my focus in life tended to be mostly somewhere else, including fitness, music, video games or cartoons, and drawing was a hobby on the side at that time, but now it's shifted to art being my main focus and the other things having stepped back as interests I still have. I've also shifted from wanting to work for a studio at a company or doing freelance at first to wanting to become an independent artist now, and because of this I am focusing on drawing what I really want to draw instead of possibly doing a portfolio for a studio. And seeing lots of other artists work through social media was also a big influence to me, and I got exposed to different things this way and determined what I personally enjoy seeing and drawing because of this, which is pretty and cute anime boys, focusing on the poses or faces, sometimes designing outfits, either drawing fan art of currently mainly Genshin characters or designing characters myself. I would always want to work in projects mainly. I only really started focusing on improving my art fundamentals around 1 year ago. The other year before I would sometimes watch tutorials whenever I would need them or be interested. That's how I got used to Krita, the software I use, and got to know some features, and in general I got used to drawing digitally. Afterwards I established a study routine to really learn from the tutorials as well as some daily drawing exercises. I would also always do projects alongside with this. Now I'll talk about different aspects in my art and the biggest lessons I learned or improvements I made for them, as well as just stylistic changes I made over time. First, for the proportions or the perspective of the bodies and the anatomy. In general, because of a lack of perspective and anatomy knowledge, the bodies I drew tended to be very flat and anatomically incorrect sometimes. After some time I then also started to heavily stylize the proportions, leading to characters I drew looking very skinny. Stylizing is okay to me, but this is way too much for me, and I was kinda covering up that I didn't have lots of anatomy knowledge by drawing really skinny people. It's weird to me how when I was drawing it I was thinking, yeah, I know I stylize the proportions and make the characters thinner, but this looks visually pleasing to me, and now it just doesn't look good to me at all. You can also comment if the proportions in my current art look too skinny to you. I'd like to know what others think. Don't be afraid to give me critique. I would appreciate it as long as it's honest and respectful. I try to improve on my proportions, and right now the characters I draw still look kind of thin, but not in an unappealing way to me. Through observing lots of references, studying anatomy and perspective, through videos and my daily drawing exercises where I draw 3 poses and 3 heads each day, I improved on the general anatomy, the hands as well as the faces. And the faces is what I'll talk about next. I started out with proportions that were a bit more realistic. I then went to sharp, thin, point, and to me now deformed faces for the characters I drew. And for how I currently draw faces, I made the face shape a bit more rounded and the chin not be just point. I also established guidelines I'd use to get the proportions I like. I was focusing on the symmetry of the faces, the eyes, and wanted the general face as well as the eyes to not be too flat. Perspective is still something I'm working on. And now we move on to the line work I would use. In the beginning I would sometimes use no lines or very thick lines with no line variation, then moved on to very thin lines with almost no line variation. Afterwards I then added some line variation and made some lines slightly thicker for how I currently do the line work. And for example, I would make the whole silhouette outline be a bit thicker than the hair or outfit details, for example. For the colors, in the beginning I used lots of different color palettes. I then shifted to more pastel and cold colors, which were very bluish. For the colors I use now, I shifted this to be in a more purpley or pinkish tone and added a bit of warmth into the palette I would use. About colors in general, they are the thing that probably least bothers me about my old art. The lines and proportions are what bothers me the most about my old art. Moving on to shading. In the beginning I experimented with some painterly and cell shading, which would often look muddy since I was using black to shade. Sometimes I do some hue shifting, but to me this looks too grayish now. I then focused on only cell shading, and for some time I'd only use dark blue on a multiply layer to shade, which is too cold to me now, especially for the skin color. Maybe I could do a redraw and use the same way of shading with newer art someday. It would be fun to see if it looks nicer now, since it could work just as a stylistic choice. For a now shade, I added a bit of a painterly approach. I'm now combining cell shading by selecting areas in shadow and painting it in or filling it in. Sometimes I'd blur edges and add more transitions. For the colors, for the shading, I'm always using hue shifting, using a slightly darker color than the base color with the hue shifted towards purple. And lastly, some things about my general process, things I learned about time effectiveness when it comes to drawing. I start with keyboard shortcuts. At the beginning I'd not use any of them, not even undo. Then I transitioned to using undo and a few, and now I'm using lots of keyboard shortcuts, which saves me lots of time. Just getting used to it in the beginning takes a bit of time, but it's really worth it to me. I started drawing on a tablet PC, which was nice, but my pen would sometimes disconnect, and I've now gotten a new drawing tablet which I have connected to my PC. The file sizes I can use are much bigger now and everything works a bit smoother. I can also use my PC display as a second screen with my references and an overview window from my drawing program, which is really helpful to me. In the beginning I was also at first establishing what step I'd want to take for drawing. These steps include the sketching, line art, flat colors, shading, and finally coloring the lines and final adjustments. After I had these steps figured out, I then started to refine the process I use. Since I'm a very structured person, I like to plan or organize. I have established a general workflow I'd use for drawing, and depending on the project I'm working on, I make adjustments to this. Over time, this whole process changes, of course, with the things you learn, but just having this as a baseline helps me with not feeling overwhelmed and being able to really focus on drawing itself when I'm drawing, and not having to spend time wondering what I'm working on next. When I notice I'm struggling with something, I'll also take notes in a document which I review from time to time to figure out my own current weaknesses and what I want to improve on. Also, when I'm spending really long on one part, I've learned it's better for me to move on to something else to save time. In general, learning to be mindful while drawing and being aware of what I'm doing, what I'm struggling with, and asking myself how I would improve different things. Having a problem-solving mindset while drawing is very helpful to me. And finally, having a set time in the day where I draw and using other time to plan what I'm drawing, so I don't have to think about what to draw during my drawing time and can focus solely on drawing the best way I can, helps me a lot as well. And for the end, I'll talk about the things I want to focus on improving on in the future. First we have anatomy, perspective and faces, since I like to draw characters so much, and since I also haven't focused that much before, I would also want to improve on drawing clothes. As I said before, I mostly use pastel colors, which means there is not as much contrast in the art, but for some of my art I feel like it could still use more contrast. Sometimes the images just look too bright and the shadows are not intense enough, so for this I will probably pay more attention to the values in my art. Something I've also gotten more interested in over the past month is having a wow factor in my art. Other than getting the fundamentals down to really make the art interesting, it should be unique and kind of portray a bit of who you are and convey a feeling to the viewer. You can really see how important this is when you look at popular artists in general. Not all of them have mastered the fundamentals. Some have lots of people liking the art simply because it looks visually appealing and gives them a specific feeling. Balancing learning the art fundamentals as well as finding out what makes your own art unique is what I want to focus on here. At the beginning, I'd say it makes more sense to just focus on the fundamentals. Often the unique part will also come naturally over time with the stylistic choices you made, but asking yourself some questions about who you are, what your interests are, what art you like yourself, and what feeling you want to convey in your art, as well as about your own process, what do you like to spend time on, can help. Maybe you enjoy putting lots of time into complex backgrounds, or maybe you don't. Depending on what you like, you can make choices on what to include in your art. I would not use this as an excuse to skip learning some basics about perspective, for example, for backgrounds though, since the fundamentals are what helps most of the time, no matter what you like to draw. That's it for this video. You can comment what you think about balancing this knowledge of the fundamentals as well as the own unique stylistic choices you make as an artist. I find it's a very interesting topic. Maybe I'll talk more about it in some other video as well. I hope this could inspire you and you could learn something from the different things I mentioned I learned over time. You can also leave a comment about your own art journey and progress. I'd love to hear others' experience. Thanks for watching and have a nice day. Goodbye.